Welcome back to the conversation, everyone. Dan here with the Dear Christians podcast. And this season, I'm really excited about the conversations that we're going to be having in this coming season. I have a feeling this is going to be known as the season of deconstruction for the Dear Christians podcast. Most of the guests that we're having on and we have lined up all center around the pros, the cons, the controversies around the topic of deconstruction. Now, if you don't know what I mean when I say deconstruction, well, maybe we'll dive into that with my guest today. But essentially, my understanding of it is the ability to critique and look at critically the faith that you grew up with. At least that's how it's been for me. But it seems like the definition of it kind of varies a little bit based on whoever is attacking or embracing it. And that's going to be part of our conversation today. I am really, really thrilled and excited and privileged to have Tim Whitaker joining us. If you don't know Tim and his work, he is from the New Evangelicals. He's the facilitator and creator of that, which is a Jesus-centered and inclusive community that holds space for people who have been marginalized by the evangelical church. He advocates for accountability and helps people explore the Christian tradition. And with that, I will welcome him into the conversation. Welcome, Tim, to the Dear Christians podcast.
Hello. Thank you for having me. It's great to be here, Dan. Thanks.
It's a blessing that you said yes. This is actually our second go around. The first time my internet was acting really terrible. So I am gracious and grateful that you willingly said, yes, I'll give this another shot, even though your internet was terrible or whatever the heck was the problem last time. But
it's no worries.
I'm glad to have you here. Yeah, stuff happens, right? It's the internet. It's the way the world is now. Before we dive into the deconstruction conversation, for those who are not familiar with you and maybe not familiar with other than the brief little introduction I just gave about the New Evangelicals, tell us a little bit about that. How did that get started? How did you decide to embrace the title or promote the title, the New Evangelicals? What did that look like for you?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot leading up to it, but kind of one of the moments where I actually thought of the title, the New Evangelicals, was during COVID and just seeing how some evangelical people, worship leaders, and other more conservative pundit types were acting and trying to make it seem like, wearing a mask was tyranny, or these lockdowns are just another sign of big government. And as Christians, we have to resist such a thing. I thought, this is so strange. Like, it's a pandemic. This doesn't happen very often. We usually do wear masks. Social distancing is kind of what we do to preserve, the most vulnerable among us. And that's when I really thought, and again, there were things leading up to this, but that's what led me to think we need a new evangelical movement. Like this whole movement that I've been a part of, I can no longer deny the problems that I'm seeing that are, I think, way more egregious than maybe some of the good that it does. And that's when I started the Instagram account in December 2020. And then here we are about a little over 2 years later. And, now we're a nonprofit organization and I do this work full time and just trying to make it happen. So that's kind of like the bare bones story of kind of how I got here.
Before this, what was it you were doing?
Oh, I've always kind of been one of those do whatever I can to make a living and then kind of fuel my passion. So as far as like what I did for a living, I did project management for a little bit. I drove for Lyft for a little bit. I worked for my parents' construction company on like the office end for a little bit. I've worked at Apple before. I worked at Starbucks before. You name it. I've probably done some version of it.
Jack of all trades.
Yeah. I went to college for a few years. I ended up dropping out. I just couldn't. At the time of my life, I was too focused on music and traveling and did not have the discipline to like really sit down and focus. I'm not diagnosed with ADHD, but I think I have a lot of those tendencies. I've never gotten an official diagnosis or anything, but I tend to have it's hard for me to kind of keep concentrating on one thing for very long, etc. And so, so I've done whatever I could just to kind of pay the bills until really this work came along.
There we go. So explain, I guess, the mission and the vision of the New Evangelicals on your website. You talk about how it's a space for a safer space for people to be able to explore the Christian tradition. And I just figured, for starters, why not give you an opportunity to tee up for those that are listening, who have a much more negative and critical understanding of Christianity, or maybe they've been hurt by it in the past, why you're doing what you're doing, and how it's different maybe than church or evangelicalism that they may be associated with in the past.
Yeah, I mean, I there's a very fair critique that we get from people who mean well, who say, hey, I just can't get behind the whole evangelical language. I say, hey, I totally get that. I mean, the word evangelical just means someone who brings good news. I don't think evangelicals today are bringing good news, and so that's why we're called the new evangelicals. But we really exist. I mean, on paper, on our website, our mission statement is that we exist for folks marginalized by the evangelical church. Now, obviously, this when people have this crisis of theology, they go all different directions. Some people walk out of the Christian tradition, they walk out of that house completely, and I respect that. We cheer them on. There's good reasons why people walk away. But there are a lot of people who are like, well, I can't stay in this basement anymore, but there's got to be more to Christianity than this conservative evangelical fundamentalism that I've grown up in. And that's where we kind of step in and say, hey, yes, like, we're with you. We used to live in that basement. We understand how that world works. But also, if you want to keep exploring the Christian tradition, you're actually sitting underneath a massive house that has many rooms, with many people thinking about better ways forward in the Christian tradition. So we do three things, essentially. We hold space for folks marginalized by the evangelical church. That's like storytelling. We have a private Facebook community where folks can just kind of let off some steam and vent. We advocate for accountability inside of evangelical spaces. That's more like our social media content in general. And then we help people explore their Christian tradition. That's mostly done by via like our podcast, where we have different types of theologians on, ranging from some more conservative, but a lot more in like the progressive or liberation spaces of Christianity, or Orthodox spaces like Eastern Orthodox. Or we also do a Theology 101 Zoom class for free, where we actually bring on a legitimate scholar or theologian to walk us through maybe the room that they exist in and why they exist in that room. So we are pretty wide in what we offer, but those are the three key things that we do that kind of make us the new evangelicals.
Gotcha. So the big buzzword, and I know we mentioned it already, deconstruction.
Yeah.
I can assume that the word deconstruction comes up a lot in conversations that you have with a lot of these people on your website and in social media. It has become a real hot button conversation in the evangelical world over the last couple of years.
Totally.
And so before we move forward in talking about some of the critiques and criticisms of what that word means for, the Mark Driscolls out there and all that sort of stuff. When you talk about deconstruction, or deconstructing Christianity, deconstructing their faith, deconstructing evangelicalism. What do you mean by deconstruction when you're using that word in conversation?
Well, I mean, listen, to be fair, we don't use that word a whole lot these days. In fact, I didn't even know that the term existed until I started the New Evangelicals on Instagram. I didn't know that.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, I hadn't. Listen, when I started TNE, I was still attending my church, a conservative evangelical church. Like, this was, I'm not someone who had a traumatic experience at age like 25, left the church, and then started this work 5 years later. My whole life leading up to, and even for part of my work at TNE, was involved in evangelical conservative spaces. So I wasn't aware of the term deconstruction. But when I discovered it, it seemed like it seemed like a word to use to describe this process of renegotiating your faith. Right? Maybe you renegotiate and you say, you know what, this faith's not for me. Maybe you say, hey, I have to rethink how I view the Bible, etc. What I tell people is that deconstruction is an explosion. It's not a movement. People go in all different directions, and they're allowed to. But for our work, and I think even a lot of the places and folks that I hang out with and talk to, none of us are really using that deconstruction term super often for a lot of reasons. I do think it's a little too vague, and I don't think it's specific enough. So for us, we tend to
I could
use
agree with that.
yeah, we tend to use the phrase like renegotiating faith, going through a crisis of theology, disentangling faith, things like that.
Gotcha. So with that said, you've had, I know, gone head to head as I have on social media a few times, with some pretty prominent names and people who have since blocked you, like Mark Driscoll, I think blocked
Oh
you,
yeah,
right?
sure.
He blocked me too, blocked me twice, actually. He didn't realize he blocked he blocked the podcast one almost immediately, when I started engaging with them. And then my personal one, he finally blocked that like sometime this last year. But
it's like when Dwight and Andy are fighting and they're shunning each other. You know, Dwight's like
shun,
from the office,
unshun.
unshun. You know,
So
it's like one of those situations.
Right, exactly. But I wanted to take a look at a couple things that he'd said on his social media a while back about deconstruction specifically, because I feel like there's this weird disconnect taking place in the minds of those who are very, very fearful or angry about this whole process of deconstruction becoming popularized.
Sure.
That I think is worth addressing and kind of bringing to the forefront of the conversation, because when they start talking about deconstruction, it very quickly in my mind goes, well, that's definitely not what I'm talking about.
Right.
When I'm using this term, or when I'm talking with people who are embracing this process and this term, what you're defining there is not what they're talking about. So
sure.
As an example here, here's some tweets from Mark Driscoll. This is back in January of this year, so it was a while ago. But the term deconstruction was apparently seriously heavy on his mind, and he starts talking about, okay, dear pastors, don't chase after apostates when they deconstruct their faith, because crowds abandoned Jesus, right, when he was speaking the truth. So, take it as a badge of honor or something like that. And then he starts breaking down vocabulary translations. Like he's seriously on the warpath here about this whole deconstruction process, saying that when someone uses the term spiritual abuse, they're just talking about when the pastor tells them to stop sinning.
Yep.
Gaslighting, which is a real thing, just means my pastor told me Jesus said to stop sinning. No, that is not what, like, very dismissive and disregarding of what people are actually going through. And then here's the crazy one that I thought was a little bizarre. I follow Jesus, not Paul, as in the Apostle Paul, right? And his translation of that is I don't follow Jesus at all.
Right.
Like that's what someone means, right? And using the word toxic means biblical.
Yeah.
Buddying this with, I don't know if you ever heard John Cooper.
Oh yeah, of course I know who John Cooper is.
John Cooper, right?
We followed his stuff and critiqued it many times.
Quite a bit, I'm sure. Here's the thing. I've got a clip here I want to share, so everybody has an idea of kind of what we're talking about when we discuss deconstruction here, and we start talking about the hope that comes with deconstruction for evangelical Christianity. There's a big group. Mark Driscoll, one example we just showed, and John Cooper as well has been extremely critical of it. Here's how they are defining deconstruction.
Listen to me, young people up in here. This is so important. There is no such thing as divorcing Jesus Christ from the Bible. That is not a thing. I don't hate those deconstructed Christians. I pray for their repentance. But listen, they have divorced themselves from God, and they want to take as many of you people as they can. And it is time for us and your generation to declare war on this idolatrous deconstruction Christian movement.
Right. So I mean, you're chuckling, and I can't help but chuckle a little bit too. But I'm also like, what the hell are they talking about?
I can answer that for you.
I mean, please respond, I guess.
All right.
Because I'm genuinely like, why are you defining this process in that way specifically for everybody that's using the term? It makes no sense to me.
This is what gatekeepers do. Okay. The evangelical gatekeeper machine has these people who see themselves as the arbiters and the protectors of God's truth. And what that really is the evangelical industrial complex that we are a part of or have been a part of. And what happens is that whenever someone critiques the evangelical industrial complex or the theology that upholds it, or the patriarchy or the harm or the abuse, that makes a gatekeeper have their alarm bells go off and say, oh my God, someone's attacking the Christian faith. And now that they're attacking the Christian faith, I have to be a good Christian and defend the faith from these so-called apostates. This is how the machine works. They take terms that have been discussed at length with nuance, with consideration, with people sharing their story, and they say, okay, we're going to throw that out because you're not from our tribe. We're going to redefine the term, and then we're going to tell our tribe what this new term actually means. Okay.
Right.
And that happens with so many things. I mean, the deconstruction is not the only one.
Yeah.
It happens with certain theological perspectives. I mean, I remember when Rob Bell wrote the book Love Wins, and John Piper says, farewell, Rob Bell, on Twitter. And Rob Bell pretty much overnight had all of his evangelical things canceled from him, right? Taken away. He's not doing this conference. His book is in hot water. People are telling their churches, don't buy the book, not because Rob Bell wasn't Christian, but because in one chapter of one book he wrote, he questioned if maybe hell was not forever, or maybe the ultimate point of hell was to be reconciled to Christ forever. Right? That's not even a heretical theology. That is well seated in the Christian tradition. That's some of the earliest church fathers.
They don't want to open up the door to even explore that conversation.
Exactly. That's what I'm saying.
They don't want to do it. Yeah.
You're exactly right, Dan. And so this is how the machine works. That's why I chuckle, because, and listen, we have a strict policy of non-dehumanization, even towards folks that we don't like. But I say that to say, without trying to dehumanize John Cooper is very foolish. Okay? He's a very foolish person, because he's convinced himself that his brand of evangelical fundamentalism is the Christian tradition, and nothing beyond his brand of fundamentalism is allowed to be Christian.
Right.
That is arrogant. That is prideful. That is ignorant. It shows a complete lack it shows a complete lack of understanding for the complex and massive Christian tradition that we're a part of.
Yeah.
What John is doing, even on a macro level, is saying, okay, Eastern Orthodox, Catholic, Ethiopian Orthodox, Coptic Christians, they're all not Christian. They're done. Even though John's tradition is actually one of the more recent traditions to kind of spring up in Christianity.
Right.
John has no problem writing off traditions that are older than his.
Right.
It's foolish.
Yeah.
And Mark Driscoll is an abusive pastor who's prideful, arrogant, and is not repentant. And so while I certainly take his words seriously because of the power and sway that he has, I don't respect him, nor do I respect what he says about these things, because honestly, I find him to be a loud, clanging cymbal with very stinky theology that harms
resounding
people.
Gong and a clanging cymbal.
And there is a paradox for me of I have to follow this. I have to take it seriously. It influences people, but on the merits of respect, or even seeing him as someone that is worth seriously engaging when it comes to his talking points. No, absolutely not. However, we will respond, we will critique, and we will say, hey, evangelicalism, you have a problem here, and here's one of them.
Yeah. And I think about the redefining of a term to then be able to critique it. Like, it's a very straw man kind of approach to anything that you find to be objectionable, right? And you see it being embraced by Christians on a whole lot of different issues. One of the biggest ones that I can think of that most people are probably going to connect with, if they're not connecting with deconstruction, is this idea of redefining the term woke and using it as an insult or something to attack, right?
Yes.
And it's very, very entrenched in politics. But the idea that being woke in the actual definition is being aware of and recognizing possible oppression that may have or does exist within our system, and that someone else's experience is not the same as yours, right? And having a level of empathy, sympathy, and seeking to understand, right? Like walking in, if you would allow me to go there, walking in the fruits of the Spirit, right?
Yeah.
Walking in love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, meekness, self-control. I use that a lot on this podcast because I feel like it is at the core of what we are supposed to be walking in if we're walking in the Spirit, right? That, in my understanding of woke, quote unquote, is just walking in the fruits of the Spirit towards everybody, including those that we may not necessarily agree with or get along with all the time, or others that we just don't understand why or how they are the way that they are, or the world that they live in. But no, people want to take that term and then redefine it as something to attack, redefine it and make it be something evil, something demonic, something that is being embraced by apostates, which, again, that term, I feel a lot of people keep throwing that term around without really knowing what that term means.
Yeah.
Well,
I really quick.
No one's rejecting Jesus when we're talking about that stuff, so go ahead. You had a question.
Yeah. Just on the whole woke conversation, this is actually a great example of how conservative evangelicalism bites itself in the butt. Because first off, you're right. I mean, the term woke has been appropriated from Black culture. It's been redefined to mean nothing. I mean, no one,
Right,
I've never heard an actual like conservative definition that they all agree on what it means to be quote unquote woke. The term woke,
that it's bad and the devil, right?
Yeah, exactly. It seems to be anything that might be slightly left of them in any capacity is automatically woke. But it's funny because it's like, okay, if you read the Sermon on the Mount, was Jesus woke? I mean, like, Jesus, love your enemies. What are Christians going to say to that? Oh, I don't know. Jesus sounds kind of woke. Blessed are the poor. Blessed are the meek. Blessed are the, like if you just read,
blessed are the poor in spirit.
In Matthew,
that's not very alpha male. What the hell is wrong with you, Jesus?
I mean, in Matthew 25, Jesus essentially says judgment is coming if you don't take care of the sick and clothe the naked. That sounds pretty social justice-y to me. Is that woke? And that's the thing, is like their own ideology and their own rhetoric of, like John Cooper said, you can't divorce Jesus from the Bible. Great. Agreed.
Totally
so let's
agree.
read what Jesus said, John. Like, let's just forget for a second. We can look at this black and white without any context. Just read the words of Jesus that we have in the 4 Gospels. You're going to come away with a pretty shocking description of Jesus that completely betrays this whole right-wing conservative ethic that they claim is actually them standing on God's biblical inerrant word. It collapses in on itself. And that's why so many of us are like, wait a second, this is ridiculous. Like this, you're actually just saying words without any conviction, because you're actually more committed to your political allegiance of far right politics than you are actually of the Bible you claim that people like me don't take seriously. Give me a break.
And that's the side of it that I think I am trying as much as I can through this podcast and other circles that I'm in and conversations that I'm having. I'm trying as best as I can to challenge the narrative that, one, if you're a Christian, you have to be a conservative Republican, right? But then, two, if you are going to deconstruct, that means that you're walking away from your faith, or that you're twisting and distorting and perverting the Word of God, right? Which is more in line with what an apostate would be doing. When in reality, I look at it, and I've said this on this podcast before with other guests. When at the end of conversation I had with Julie Roys of the Roys Report.
Yeah, she's great.
I praised her very much for what she's doing, because I feel like she is exposing, and what she and her team and others like her are doing is exposing very much the cultural and political and socioeconomic influence and power that has seeped into the way that churches govern here in the United States, and elevated all of that to a point that it's idolatrous. Like, it's an idolatrous pursuit of political power. It's an idolatrous pursuit of personal power. It's an idolatrous, fill in the blank. It's rooted in idolatry. And the only way that you're going to remove that is by bringing a level of accountability and refining, if you will, of separating the wheat from the chaff, right? Refining through the fire. Like, we got to go through this whole difficult, awful, look at the dirty side of what's going on process to be able to remove all the bullshit and then have the genuine Jesus and the cross and what Christianity really is at the end of the day. And what we have to show for it is the real truth, the real gospel. But everyone who's entrenched in all of that other cultural bullshit and political bullshit that's been infusing itself into the way Christianity has defined itself in the United States, they're going to hate it and they're going to resist it, because that's been their definition of Christianity for so long. And they can't imagine Christianity being anything without it, you know?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, this is not a new problem.
No, it's really not.
Anyone who reads a couple of basic American history books that focus on the Christian movement in America will see this is Donald Trump, and what we're seeing now. This is just the fruit of such an ideology taking root for so long. Listen, this is uncomfortable to hear for people. It was uncomfortable for me to hear, but the tradition that I grew up in was born out of white supremacy.
Yeah.
The tradition I was born in was rooted in this concept that we have God on our side. God wants us to destroy our enemies. So let's wipe out the people who inhabit the land before we colonize it. Right. This is our history. Yeah. Okay. I'm not saying every Christian had these views. In fact, some actually put their bodies in between that colonialism and imperialism and their neighbor. So that's beautiful. But to make it seem like somehow that was the dominant perspective, right? And the slave owners and the segregationists were somehow a minority is not the case. Yeah, it's just not.
And to go down the route of saying that this nation, like the whole Christian nationalism idea that God has somehow created some sort of unique, specially anointed relationship with the United States, and that this country was founded as a Christian nation on Christian principles, is to ignore the reality that slavery, as a huge part of that, actually played in the birth of this nation, right? Like, if you're saying God's hand was in everything and that it was all built off of Christian principles and values, let's remember that meant, okay, Black people were 3/5 of a person.
Yeah.
That means women did not have a right to speak and vote on things that were impacting that. Like, the only thing that made you have a voice was if you were a property owner, and only white people were owning property. Like, you're saying God's hand was in dictating and narrating come on, think for a second about the actual history and what that statement means to everybody else that isn't a white dude, like the two of us, ironically. Right?
Well, I mean, I'm not convinced that evangelicalism has the ability for self-reflection. Like I'm not convinced that evangelicals
on the whole or individual, because I would say
no, both.
The individual. I mean, I grew up in the realm of evangelicalism. I mean, you did too, and here we are self-reflecting.
Yeah, in the minority opinion.
Right. No,
that's what I'm saying. Is
like
true. It's like, if you look like evangelicalism,
it's possible, but it's extremely hard and rare and difficult.
Well, right, exactly. And I think that's one of the main ingredients that caused so many of us to either leave Christianity or leave evangelicalism, was we started self-reflecting and saying, wait a second, things don't add up here. Things don't make any sense here. How can you, Mr. Church person who raised me, and tell me that to be a good Christian, I have to adhere to this sexual ethic that God has established before the beginning of time, and then tell me with a straight face, if I don't vote for Trump, somehow I'm the problem, right? That's one easy example of demonstrating when you start self-reflecting. But the evangelical machine is convinced that they have an exclusive truth about God that no one else has. And therefore, they're always going to be in their minds doing way more right than wrong. And so I don't think that evangelicalism as an a complicated institutional system of publishers and churches and worship and, all of those tentacles, they really think that they are doing the work of God and that they have to save a dying world. And anyone outside of their brand of Christianity is dying. So because of that, whatever the culture does is always going to be seen through a lens of, well, yeah, sure, Trump isn't great, but look at what he did for us. Look at how he's bringing God back to America. And that's why you don't see
ends justify the means every time.
Right. And that's why you don't see this. I mean, listen, Dan, just to put it bluntly, we've had Trump in our lives for 7 years. The man has incited insurrection. The man has blown away any kind of evangelical sexual ethic. He just got arrested on potential corruption charges. And what's the evangelical response? I can tell you, they just had a prayer vigil for him last night, right before he got arraigned, with some of the biggest evangelical leaders in the U.S., James Dobson, Paula White, Eric Metaxas, Sean Foyt, people
he's being persecuted, right?
Well,
that's what they're all saying.
Exactly. And I'm also saying that, the president of the Christian Counselors Association was on that call. These are not fringe people. And Michelle Bachmann's on that call, former legislator, and they're praying, God, protect the president against this evil. That is a problem. And there's no awareness. There's no ability to see, actually, maybe we were on the wrong side of this situation. You're not going to see it en masse.
And it's ends justify the means is always, I feel like, at the root of it, because you look at things like John Edwards, right? When he was found guilty of the exact, very, very similar to the kind of thing that Trump was just indicted for. But his political agenda didn't line up with their political agenda. So that was the righteous hand of God bringing accountability to him. But in this situation, clearly it's not God bringing accountability to a person who has been thumbing his nose at what it means to actually be no, of course not. This is now an attack from the enemy. The level of gaslighting taking place in the community, and again, going back to Mark Driscoll's wonderful definition, right? Gaslighting means I'm telling you Jesus told you not to sin, right? It's funny how that's never really, really, really brought up in the context of someone like Donald Trump. It's never really brought up, right?
Yeah. Can you go back to Mark's tweets? I want to point something out to you.
Yeah.
Can you pull it back up?
Yep.
So this is what I think is so important for the audience to hear and recognize. So underneath this, he says two things here. In that first tweet, he essentially at the end says, better a small flock of Christians than a large flock of pagans, which is so ironic considering that he is part of one of the largest Christian demographics in America.
He loves to brag about how many people he has following him. And
the man paid a publisher or some PR organization to buy his own books to get him on the New York Times bestseller list. Okay, so right away, this idea that, oh, poor us, we're just a small bunch, is absolute malarkey. But the other thing about this in that second tweet where he does the vocab translation, it's all about challenging the authority of the pastor, which makes sense considering that Mark Driscoll is really big on pastors having a special spiritual authority over their congregation. So gaslighting for him is, my pastor told me Jesus said to stop sinning, which is really him saying gaslighting means, oh, you challenge the pastor and I can't tolerate that.
You're questioning my authority on this. How dare you?
Exactly.
That's how he's defining it.
Spiritual abuse is, my pastor told me to stop sinning. Oh, really? That's what that means. The lady who was shamed by John MacArthur for trying to leave her abusive husband. She would like a word, Mark.
Right.
And so this is also why I chuckle, because once you go 2 inches below the surface of these phrases, they fall apart they disintegrate. There's no substance here. Mark's employing the typical rhetorical, language that he's so good at employing. But once you get beneath it, it's hollow, hot garbage.
Yeah. And here, like the last one here, I think is really interesting because he says, dear deconstructing quote unquote Christian, just like you can't be friends with me if you hate my wife, you don't get to have a relationship with Jesus if you hate his church. That right there is a message. He's saying it to the quote deconstructing Christians, but I honestly feel like that right there is a manipulative, gaslighting leadership, drawing a line in the sand for the people who are on the fence about staying with him.
Yes.
Like, that's really what's going on there. He's not really genuinely telling people who are going through a process of deconstruction, hey, you hate Jesus, then you hate the church, then you hate Jesus. You're critical of the church, then you're critical of Jesus. You're like, what he's doing is he's setting up this idea that if you are at all critical of the church, aka me and my understanding of how this place is supposed to operate,
that's right.
Then you can't be friends with Jesus, and you're not a real Christian, aka you're an apostate, right?
That's right.
That's right. It's very, very clever the way that he communicates to so many people on various different levels in a way that keeps triggering the people to continue a conversation that he loves to have because he loves the attention.
Yeah. Like
while at the same time,
very,
very much being oppressive in the message that he's sending to the people who are trying to have a genuine relationship with Jesus. And he's going, well, the only way you can do it is through doing it my way.
I mean, if Mark Driscoll was alive when Martin Luther was alive, he'd be telling Martin Luther, hey, you hate the church and therefore aren't a Christian.
That's exactly right.
I mean, literally the Catholic Church tried to kill Martin Luther.
Yep.
They tried to hunt him down and burn him at the stake for heresy.
Yeah.
And what Mark is doing here is Mark, like you said earlier, Dan, he's saying, if you don't like the church that either I'm a part of or that my friends are a part of, if you don't like the evangelical church, you therefore hate the entire church, globally speaking, and therefore you can't be a Christian. So that's more gatekeeping. And also it's a reinforcement that Mark and his people are part of the true church, and no other churches count.
Right. And it's funny because in some of the conversations that I had with him on social media that ended up getting me blocked was confronting him on that very fact.
Yeah.
Like saying, hey, you sound an awful lot like Martin Luther's Catholic critics right now.
Totally.
Like, that's what you sound like. You're saying if you're being critical of the relationship that evangelical Christianity has with politics or whatever, then now you're a heretic, you're an apostate, you're not a real Christian. How dare you, right? Like,
yep,
that is definitely gatekeeping. So with that said, how do we transition to embracing an attitude of hope through this deconstruction as we're facing this kind of criticism?
Well, I mean, one of the best ways is realizing that, I can be a Christian and not be like Mark Driscoll. That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Honestly, it's hopeful to know that I'm still seated in the Christian tradition and not worried about if I'm going to burn in hell when I die.
Right.
That's hopeful to me.
Voting for a Democrat or voting for someone that's, pro-choice does not mean that you're going to burn in hell forever because of the way that you voted. Right.
Yeah. And I have found that I'm one of those people where I deconstructed further into my faith. I didn't deconstruct out of it.
Yeah.
And so for me, I'm like, this Christian tradition actually is quite beautiful and troubling at times, of course. But there's actually a lot of beauty here and a lot of people who are brilliant scholars, theologians, teachers, pastors who are actively doing good work in their local communities, and critiquing this like love of empire that evangelicalism has. That's wonderful. That's great. So I do think that there's a lot of hope, but I also understand for some people how lonely it is and how it can be hopeless. You know, a lot of people, when they end up having different views than their church allows, like maybe it's about queer inclusion or about hell, a lot of them get forced out. They get told, hey, you're no longer part of the family. That's incredibly painful. That hurts. It happened to me. I totally get it. So I'm not trying to say like, hey, it's all rose-colored glasses. It's almost like, you know, and I hate to use the term because of how right-wing people have taken it, but it's almost like you know, getting out of the matrix, right? So in one way, life is more difficult, but also how can you go back knowing that what you were a part of was actually so sinister?
Yeah.
How can you do that?
And
you have to carve better paths forward.
Manipulative, very, you know, deceitful in a lot of ways. Like
totally.
Yeah. And the hope side of it for me was in realizing that when I mean, seriously wrestling with depression and just a lot of serious stuff.
Yeah.
Realizing that being critical of the church.
Yeah.
By the church, I mean the, you know, organized, established, not like the bride of Christ in a theological sense, but the church as in the man-made structural leadership, organizational governance side of things, which, let's be honest, in today's evangelical American world looks more like a corporation than it does the church in Acts, but that's a whole nother conversation.
Right.
Realizing that you can be critical of that and you can not agree with the way that they're doing things, and also say, okay, maybe God is doing things in people's lives in those communities, and be okay with that, while at the same time saying the church doesn't have to be that.
Yeah.
The church is much broader and much bigger than that. And when I started diving a little bit deeper into what the church looks like abroad, both throughout history, but then also even in recent history, I have multiple friends who are missionaries overseas. I have friends in Japan. I got friends in China. I have some down in Belize. And the church looks radically different in those communities than it does here in the United States, almost to the extent that it was the more conversations I have with them about what it means to be a Christian and what it means to live a life that is reflecting the character of God, like the way that we're doing church here, the typical, like, check the boxes of what Christianity is supposed to look like here in the United States, most of that is irrelevant. Absolutely irrelevant. It all comes down to who Jesus is and who you say he is, and how are you committing to him, and how you're living your life. And like, it's really cool to see the hope of deconstruction bringing people like you and people like me back to the fundamentals. Really the fundamentals. Trying to weed out all the other stuff and go, okay, what is the core fundamental of what it means to be a Christian? And am I actually there?
Yeah.
You know?
No, I think that's fair. I mean, I don't know what the fundamentals are, because depending on who you ask, you get different answers.
True. And that's
something about following the way of Jesus,
you
know?
That's part of the process of and I think to some degree part of the beauty of the actual process of deconstruction is that it is challenging people to go through that messy process. And get into the Word of God and have meaningful conversations with people that you know and trust to find that out. You know,
I think that, at least for me, deconstruction was and is humbling. It was a reminder that depending on when I was born in history and what culture I grew up in, my fundamentals of the faith might look a little bit different, right? Like, I mean, I think it's safe to say that, like, the overwhelming amount of people believe in like a physical resurrection. Okay, we could probably, most of us, agree on that. I mean, there's a few like John Dominic Crossan who might debate that as a Christian, but I think by and large, the physical resurrection is a big deal, right? But like, what that means, how it's lived out, the Trinity, the virgin birth, the scriptures, the inerrancy of Scripture, yet in line. I mean, the Eastern Orthodox Bible is not the same Bible as the Protestant Bible. We have different books in our Bibles. And even how, I'm not the expert here, but my understanding is that Eastern Orthodox people are not so obsessed about biblical inerrancy. Like, that's not part of the conversation for them. But for us, it's like, are you a biblical inheritance? If you're not really a Christian, right? It's
Right.
like one of those gatekeeping things.
Yeah.
So I think that for me, this process of renegotiating faith has humbled me and made me realize, like, it's not my job to draw these boundaries, because how could I? Like, I am one finite person in one. I mean, even at the most, let's say I live to be 100. That is still, a grain of sand on the shore of time. And so to try and claim that I know what the infinite being of the universe, who spoke the cosmos into existence, and who is in all things, which we have our being, right?
Mm-hmm.
Somehow I know what that objective truth of that thing is, and what it means to be a Christian in that way. Like, that's an audacious claim. And then people say, well, no, Tim, we have the Bible. The Bible's clear. Okay, the majority of Christians who ever lived never had access to a Bible, let alone an English Protestant Bible. Right.
Right.
So
What,
we just hit the jackpot. Like, we're just the most fortunate Christians to ever exist, to have the objective truth of God's word that God for some reason waited millions of years to actually give people. Come on. It does not hold water.
We got lucky in the fact that we were in the right place at the right time in history to have the perfect 100% literal esteemed understanding of every ounce of word of God in the English language. Perfectly.
Exactly.
Right? Exactly. The idea that the inerrancy, and this is something that I've been wrestling with through my own process of deconstruction, the concept of inerrancy in Scripture is something that I feel it's an issue that has become such a third rail to even remotely, brush across with so many Christians in the evangelical community. And they instantly go, oh, you're not a real Christian if you don't believe in inerrancy. And then I immediately go, what do you mean by inerrancy? Like, legitimately, when you say inerrancy, are you saying the English translation of the Bible that you hold in your hand is 100% perfect in its translation of exactly what was being said and spoken over 2,000 years ago? Is that what you mean by inerrancy?
Right.
Because if that's what you mean by inerrancy, you're a fucking moron.
Well, it is.
That is not like inerrancy. Just studying and understanding linguistics, just knowing and meeting and talking with people who are like professional translators. And I work in education. I deal with a lot of foreign language teachers, people who have the challenge of trying to explain and understand multiple different languages and translate it into English, and like the complexities of that. Right. So I've had many interesting conversations and been privy to different conversations about how difficult it is just to translate small phrases from one language to another in the spoken word, let alone the written word,
right?
So that it is perfectly understood as best as possible. It's near impossible sometimes. Like, it's incapable. Then you take that into the context of multiple different manuscripts written in various different languages, and then translated in some cases from Greek and Hebrew into Latin and then into English. Like, come on. When you say inerrancy, let's take a real honest look at what we mean by inerrancy and be real and honest about it. Right.
That's
not right. Reducing. They're like, well, now you're reducing the power of the word of God and yada, yada, yada. And I'm thinking, no, I'm thinking you have created a idol out of the Bible when the Bible isn't what saved you. Jesus was.
Yeah, I mean, it's bibliolatry.
Right. I didn't know there was a word for it, but there you go.
I think that's the word. I don't know. I mean, I've heard it before. Listen,
if not, then here it is.
Pete N says, listen, you might not like the Bible that we have, but it's the Bible that we got. It's like, you have to take it on its own terms. You have to just acknowledge what the Bible is that we have, how we got it, how complicated it is. And like you said, Dan, the fact that translation it's not always a one-to-one. Yeah. Okay, there are turns of phrases that make sense in English that make no sense in other languages, let alone ancient languages, some of which are dead ancient languages.
Right.
So maybe we have a little more humility before we just assume God said it, that settles it. That to me is what I call indoctrination. This idea that hey, listen, I've been taught that this book I hold in my hand is God's love letter to me. That is just not what this collection of books is. And so I think what happens, though, is that people like myself, maybe you, we're told everything hinges on the Bible. If the Bible isn't what we say it is, our faith is dead. I mean, they almost treat it like how Paul treats the resurrection, right?
Yeah.
And so, but then you take a freshman level Bible course at a moderately conservative Christian college, and you go, wait a second, we don't have any of the original manuscripts.
What are
Wait
you
a
talking
second,
about?
there are competing manuscripts that actually leave out parts of Mark or the ending of Mark. What? I thought it was God's perfect infallible word, and the whole thing crumbles because we give people this paper thin view of the faith that has to be supported by propaganda and rhetoric. It's so frustrating.
Yeah. And in addition to the possibility, some might even say probability, that some translations by those who were in power and who were educated at the time could have included certain translations to help support their personal, political, power structure, whatever the agenda was at the time, because they wanted to have that level of influence over the congregation and over the masses. And to much of what Martin Luther's process was in facilitating the Reformation was looking critically at not only the power structure of the Catholic Church at the time, but looking at Scripture as it was being presented by Catholicism. And then finally the printing press came out and people were able to read it for themselves. And then he takes an honest, critical look at it and goes, wait a minute, that's not what that is.
Right.
You've been saying this the whole time, but that's not what they're. Suddenly now he's an apostate, right? Because he's questioning the written word of the Catholic Church and the spoken word of those in power. So it's nothing new.
Nothing new.
It's nothing new for Christianity. It really isn't.
Nope. It's not.
And I honestly believe, as we kind of wrap things up here, because we're getting on an hour, I honestly believe like it is genuinely a process that I think God leads the church through.
Yeah.
After so long, to kind of refine and weed out all the cultural and political garbage that influences the church and give it a restart and bring it back to fundamentals. And I honestly feel like it's an answer to prayer. I really do.
Yeah. That's kind of one of the fun things that people had brought up is like, listen, the generation ahead of us has been praying for the next generation to take the word of God and to take the Bible seriously and take the Christian faith seriously.
Right.
Okay, like prayer answered.
Here we are.
I tell people all the time, like, I'm just doing what my pastors told me to do.
Right.
They told me, don't trust me. Don't take my word for it. Read the Bible yourself. Study the Bible yourself. So I did.
Yeah.
I did.
Imagine that, right?
So
yeah. Oh yeah. When I was growing up, it was they were praying and prophesying and speaking like crazy over this entire generation that we would in one generation. I remember one pastor going, in one generation, God's gonna radically shape and frame the church and return her to her first love or whatever.
Right.
Like hearing that sort of thing over and over and over. And I look at what's happening and going, well, answer to your prayer.
Exactly.
But they hate it. They didn't know what they were praying for, apparently.
You know why? Because we've aimed the weapon at them.
Yeah.
They gave us these weapons and they told us, hey, hold people accountable. The world's dying, stand up for truth and justice. And then we go, wait a second, but you're not doing that. So we're going to talk. Yeah, we're going to hold you accountable for not.
We're going to start with you.
Exactly. I mean, and again, that's biblical.
Start with all of us.
That's
right?
1 Corinthians 5. When Paul's pretty explicit. Hold the church accountable, not the world. Yeah. So, guys, I'm not sure what to tell you. I'm doing what you told me. You radicalized me for Jesus. I can't change who I am. I'm all in on this thing. And you're mad that I'm looking at you and saying, wait a second, you're not living up to your own ideals or able to admit when you continually miss the mark and somehow I'm the problem.
Right.
Like, no, that's just not going to fly because thanks to the way they taught me, right? I'm going to stand firm on integrity and on truth and on the fruits of the Spirit. And so I'm not going to be swayed when people call me a false teacher or a heretic. It's like, listen, man, we have the receipts. When we tell you that ABCD is problematic, we're not just making it up. Like, we have the article, we have the email, we have the data supporting why we're concerned.
Yeah. Right. That's exactly right. And I think God's with you in it, man. I really do.
Maybe.
I like to wrap up every conversation by asking my guests to finish the sentence, "Dear Christians," as if you were like writing a letter to those that are listening, whether it's the whole church or just those who are listening. But if you could address the church, address Christianity, and surrounding maybe this issue or something else, maybe that God's got on your heart, but just finishing the sentence, "Dear Christians," what?
Dear Christians, please wake up to the Christian nationalism that your spaces continually promote, that ultimately want to become the empire, not subvert the empire, and that want to really privilege your own rights at the expense of your neighbors.
That's good. I hope they do.
Wake up.
Yeah, I hope they do. I hope they do. I hope we all do.
Same.
Awesome. Thank you so much for coming on the program, Tim. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Dan. It was great. Thanks for letting me rant.
Of course. That's what we do here. That's what we do. Sounds good. Thanks again.
You got it.